He did not go to the forest to conquer it. He went because he believed names could save things. Give a plant a Latin binomial, and you admit it into a ledger that will outlast roads and rebellions. He told his students that taxonomy was a kind of shelter against forgetting. On the last morning he was seen alive, he wrote a name in his field notebook and underlined it twice. And then he walked out of a circle of canvas and into green that folded him away like a letter sealed with wet leaves. His name was Dr. Jacob Riedel, 43, a biologist from Freiburg with a narrow face and blunt hands. He specialized in alkaloid-bearing lianas and the folklore that clung to them, stories of cures and curses braided through the same stem. He had taught botany for a decade in Basel, where his lectures filled with sketches drawn so quickly they seemed to appear before his chalk touched the board. On trains he made lists, things to do, plants to find, colleagues to write to. He had loved once, briefly and badly, a violinist who said he loved field notebooks more. After that he put his tenderness in his work and never again in a kitchen where someone else might drop it on the floor. The Congo had been a dream since the first time he opened a monograph on Central African florists and saw a map stippled with question marks. Rivers that change their minds, he said to a colleague. Villages that move. Plants that refuse to be summarized. He studied Lingala until he could ask for more than coffee. He read accounts of expeditions that vanished from print along with men. He knew better than to say the forest wanted him. Rainforests want no one. But they welcome, and sometimes they keep. The grant came together in a season of small mercies. A pharmaceutical foundation that liked his proposal on novel antiparasitics, a Swiss charity that liked his ethics, a Congolese university willing to host him. He assembled a team. There was a Congolese postdoc, Amy, 30 and exacting, who could quote both Gaston Bachelard and a village elder from Bandundu in the same breath and make the quotations shake hands. There were 2 field assistants, cousins from a settlement north of Opala, Moke and Tana, who could read a trail as if it were a pale thread in dark cloth. There was a driver, Lucien, who had never seen a bridge that couldn't be negotiated with a laugh and a low gear. There was an old guide, Kabila, whose beard had learned to keep secrets. And there was a young Swiss master's student who had begged for inclusion, a precise boy named Simon who loved portable scales and spreadsheets and became, in the forest, a person the others loved for how often he said, "What do you think?" instead of "I think." They flew to Kinshasa in April and on to Kisangani, where the river is a wide adjective. From there they hired 2 pirogues with outboard motors and pointed them southeast along the Lomami, the river's brown-blown glass. They carried equipment in boxes that once held powdered milk, plant presses, coils of nylon rope, tarps, a satellite phone the size of a loaf of bread, and a crate of jars filled to the meniscus with ethanol. Jacob handled the jars himself, lifting each like a fragile idea. He packed his notebooks into a yellow dry bag, labeled with tape, and the word field in block capitals. He had written the name of a plant he was hunting on the first page, Ancestrocladus riedelianus, the joke of a man sitting before a mirror rehearsing introductions. The field station was an old Belgian veterinary outpost near a tributary whose name people changed depending on mood. The roof sagged and the shutters stuck and bats had appointed themselves archivists. It was 2 hours' walk from any path that could be called a path, and there was a clearing where cassava once grew. They made a camp of 4 tents arranged like a punctuation mark around the outpost veranda. They hung a blue tarp for a lap. They strung a line for drying cloth. When rain started it sounded like a train leaving and then arriving and then standing still, all without tracks. The first days included the choreography every expedition repeats, turning a landscape into a routine. Water boiled. Socks hung. Jars labeled. The forest leaned in. Jacob moved through it like someone walking through a library whose books he had wanted to read since he could remember. Rubber saplings dabbed his arms with white. Epiphytes perched like small, curious birds. Vines wrapped trunks the way musicians wrap fingers around instruments. Sometimes there was a wall of sound, Congo gray parrots, tree frogs, cicadas that made the air vibrate like a guitar string. Sometimes there was quiet, so complete it revealed its seams. Drips, a leaf dropping through 3 layers before giving up. He had never been showy in the field. He did not cut plants he did not need. He did not step onto nurse logs with the nonchalance of a man who has not yet learned to fear rotten wood. He consulted Kabila as if the older man were a compass with more than 4 points. "That grove," he said on the 3rd day. "The one on the rise with the red palms." Kabila nodded. "Ngoya," he said. "People will not go there." He said it without dramatics. "Why?" Jacob asked, breath already half further in, as if the answer would be a green rope thrown out that he could use to pull himself in. Kabila shrugged a shrug that seemed to carry 50 years of weather. "Things do not grow in the right order," he said. "Tom is wrong there." Simon grinned at Amy. The scientist in her saw superstition as a symptom worth noting. Jacob wrote in his notebook, "Ngoya, avoid, ask later," and drew a square around the note, so it looked like a box to be ticked. They collected and measured greed. A vine with trifoliate leaves that exuded a bitter latex. A small tree with milky sap and white, star-like flowers that smelled like sugar left too long on a windowsill. Jacob's sketches multiplied, each leaf a vein-streaked portrait. He stopped sometimes to watch ants carry petals with ceremony. In the evenings he sat by lantern, his face a mask of lines the day had drawn, coaxing dried specimens into packets, writing tiny sermons on the labels. Saline riverbank, sandy loam, 0 degrees 0 minutes south, 25 degrees 0 minutes east, height 480 m, use reported for fever, infusion of bark. The team ate cassava and beans, and sometimes smoked fish that left their fingers perfumed with river. At night the forest pushed its breath through the mesh of the tent like a patient animal. On the 9th day, they met the herb. Jacob had gone ahead on a narrow trail that smelled of crushed marigold, with Kabila behind and Simon swatting the air as if punctuation might protect him from insects. The trail dropped into a shallow bowl, and there, under the canopy's reluctant light, grew a swath of low plants with opposite leaves like small green shovels and inconspicuous white flowers that looked, if you squinted, like stars seen through fog. Jacob crouched, pinched a leaf, tasted it, spat. Bitter, then sweet, then a numbness that crept up the tongue. He looked at Amy, whose eyebrows had already reached a hypothesis. It could be, she said. He wrote, A. Coropensis analog? Although he knew the species name belonged to Corup forest across a border on the map. He hung tiny paper packets of different parts of the plant on a line, the way a man airing letters might, each marked with time and place. One packet he kept in his pocket and held the way some men hold a rosary. On the 11th day, they returned to camp later than intended, because the forest is a thief of hours. The light went green and then sullen. They ate quick. Jacob stayed up, wrapping a stem whose latex had stained his fingers the color of old tea. Amy sat with him, flicking gnats out of the light. We can be careful, but not careful enough, she said. We can be lucky or unlucky for reasons that are not ours. He nodded. I do not have a hero's appetite for risk, he said. She smiled. You have a scientist's appetite for answers, she said. And then, because it needed saying, those are not the same thing. At dawn on the 12th day, the tent where he slept was a neat circle of canvas with a ping of water dropping from its fly onto a pot, turned upside down to keep it dry inside. His bedroll was unrolled but unoccupied. His boots were gone. Amy pushed the flap aside and felt the way a room swallows a name when the person belonging to it is not in it. His yellow dry bag sat on a camp chair, its mouth open like someone mid-sentence. On the table under the tarp, his field notebook lay open to a page covered with tiny elbows of script. 3 other pages had been wrenched out and now lay wet and printed to the boards. One read, Ngoya, ask again. Kabila? Moke says not. Local name, Quees? Spirit vine. Then the words slurred into threads where rain diluted them. Jacob, Amy called, using the German pronunciation he preferred, the one that made him sound less like a King James patriarch and more like a human being. No answer. She cannot say later whether she knew at once. She says only that the forest had changed key. They fanned out. Moke went to the latrine hole dug a day away from camp. Empty. Tano walked the path to the stream. Kabila stood still in the center of the clearing and turned his head in increments, listening for a small alarm the bush sometimes sounds when you touch it. Nothing but a weaver bird practicing a scale. By the time the sun decided to rise properly, all that was certain was the tent was empty and the notebook had lost its 3rd and 5th pages and the dry bag sat like an animal that had been petted and then ignored. Simon found Jacob's machete leaning against a tree under a strip of orange survey tape hung there the day before. He wouldn't go without this, Simon said. He said it as a ward more than as an observation. Amy knelt to look for prints. The earth obliged with a confusion of traces. Theirs, a diker's, 2 heavy elongated prints where a monitor lizard had hauled itself like a fat sentence across the clay. Kabila found a scuff that could be a heel headed in the direction they were not going, toward the rise where the palms with red petioles stood. They shouted until their throats were coins rubbed flat in a pocket. The forest deigned to reply the way an old courtier replies to a fool, politely, and with a smile that indicates nothing will alter the order of the room. By noon they had a decision. Call for help. The satellite phone needed coaxing and a patch of sky. Lucian walked to the termite mound on the edge of the clearing and held the phone up like a talisman until the digits condescended to climb the line. Kisangani promised a helicopter when the army could be spared and soldiers when the roads turned again into roads. The first day of a search is a fist. It closes around all possibilities as if strength can contain them. They grid the forest poorly because you cannot grid vines. They flagged trails with tape the color of loud fruit. They found nothing they could persuade to be Jacob. There were signs that could be read as signs if you wanted them to be. A twig snapped with enthusiasm, then not. A boot heel impression that looked like a heel in the way a cloud looks like a rabbit. At dusk the sky withdrew into itself, and forgot to bleed. Amy sat with a cup of tea, which in that place tasted of smoke and a particular leaf that reminded her of a childhood she had hated. She felt responsible even for weather. "He is a methodical man," she said. "Methodical men do not vanish," Simon said, because he was 23 and had not yet met all the exceptions to his rules. In the morning the helicopter arrived. It was a silver insect rude to the canopy. Men with rifles slung stood in the camp and made it smaller. An officer asked questions that did not understand what a forest is. Did he have enemies? Was he in debt? Had he been known to behave erratically? Amy said no, and he had, like all good field biologists, a set of habits that, if seen in the city, would be called peculiar because discipline always looks a little mad from across the room. The men walked with guns their boots, stirring the leaf litter like gossip. From above, the green unrolled without features. The pilot said he could see elephants sometimes when they made the forest like itself again, but today there was only a polite refusal to offer narrative. On the third day the soldiers went farther. One returned with a piece of cloth, sodden, patterned with dots. The cloth had belonged to no one in the camp. On the fourth day, Kabila found a fragment of paper lodged in a thorn. On it, the words, "Inflorescence paniculate? Ask Mama Coco." The underlines ran away into the wet. On the fifth day, the officer said the sentence officers say when they have reached an edge that will not admit a boot. "We must suspend the active search." He did not say it to Simon. He said it to Amy because he recognized in her the person who would understand procedure and resent it correctly. When the helicopter left, it took a portion of their hope with it in a whine that made dogs in an unseen village bark. They stayed a week more and searched the way people search when the official energy is gone, badly and stubbornly. They found a trail of ants so long and straight Simon felt admiration for geometry. They found nothing else. The day they agreed to leave, it rained hard, that special forest rain that turns thought into a damp rag. Amy wrapped the notebooks, the jars, the presses, every square of paper that held a line of Jacob's hand, as if wrapping the syllables themselves could keep a person intact. She left the field station as neatly as possible because you do not leave mess in a place that might need to forgive you later. The afterlife of a disappearance is an administrative procedure and a private apocalypse. Reports were filed. The university in Basel wrote a statement that praised Jacob's contribution to science and pledged to continue his work. People who had not written to him in 2 years posted photographs of him at conferences. His mother in Freiburg stood for a long time in front of a window with geraniums and said nothing that she remembered later. The Pharmaceutical Foundation quietly asked what would become of the samples. "We will analyze," Amy wrote back. She meant also, "We will grieve." She returned to Kinshasa with the boxes and then to Europe with fewer. On the plane she held the dry bag on her lap like a child and dreamed she was counting 100 identical coins, and the coin under her thumb became a leaf every time she tried to pick it up. It takes little time for a story to learn to be past tense. Riedel was, people said. Riedel used to. There were theories. They arrive on schedule like monsoon and dust. Some said he had offended a group who used the forest as a supply chain for things the city prefers not to know its heart still beats for. Others said he had walked into a place the forest keeps for itself, a depression of light where animals go to disappear and to be, which is not the same. A third theory suggested he had lost his way to a different cause, his own body, a seizure, a snake. Amy listened without endorsing. She had learned the ethical calculus of speech after disappearance. Tell only what you know can carry an invoice for truth. 2 years later, a letter arrived at the university in Kisangani addressed to no one in particular, written in a hand that had learned to be legible in another language and never lost the habit. It came from a priest in a village 3 days upriver from the field station. A man left a box in our church during the war years. We did not open it, because he said it must be opened only by people who could read its contents. The war is over, or over enough. Come. Amy went. Simon asked to go, and then thought better. Kabila was dead. Lucien said he could drive, but the road was a proposition that had not yet been accepted. They went by river, and the river reminded them who was in charge. The village church was brick with a roof repaired with iron sheets and prayers. The box was metal, army surplus, sealed with a kind of patience. Amy popped the clasps with a screwdriver. Inside lay glass. Jars like soldiers, some cloudy, some empty. Labels in Jacob's hand. She did not cry in front of the priest. She did not permit him the charity of seeing her carry what she carried. Some jars had cracked and evaporated their contents into the century. Some still held their herb ghosts. She packed the intact ones and thanked the priest. And when he said who left it, she said she did not know because sometimes the truth is not a noun. The jars returned to a lab in Kinshasa and were logged, and then moved to a basement when the project lost funding. They sat there for years, through administrations that found new flags and old debts. The rumor of them moved through the building like a draft. Students touched them as if touching would confer the glamour of risk. A guard used a dusty jar as a doorstop for a summer when the heat did not respect doorways. It was a hurricane of men, at least in the telling, that finally moved the jars out of the basement. The departure of a dean, a roof collapse, the discovery that funding could be found if one could prove one had kept the right things. A new director, tidy in shirt and impatience, ordered a clean out. The jars went upstairs. A young tech named Samuel who had, like many in his generation, learned to be gentle with old things because his parents had not been able to afford new, lifted each jar like a confession. He relabeled them with clean numbers. In one, the ethanol had turned a warm amber, the color of tea left too long. He wiped the glass with his sleeve and then stopped. The liquid held not only plant. It held something pale and blunt and human in shape. He set the jar down with the reverence of a man setting a sleeping child in a crib. He did not shout. He did not even call at once. He looked first for the label, because an answer deserves context. There was none. The jar was unlabeled. The hand that had written every other jar's label in thin, upright script. Even when the hand that wrote it had been tired. Even when that hand had belonged to a man who had been wet and bitten and had a stone in his shoe, he would not stop to dislodge. The hand had left this one without a name. Samuel called the director. The director called the police. The police called the university in Basel because the rumor that the jars had been part of the Riedel expedition had never stopped being true enough to be useful. In a room that had once been a colonial office where an engineer had measured river flow with a ruler and a sermon, the jar stood on a table under light that had been made for examining less difficult things. The object inside looked like a story refused. A finger. Human. Index. Middle. A little shriveled, but anything that has lost its blood will shrivel when you assign it to alcohol. The nail was still attached, an afterthought at the end of a pale idea. The bone gave the shape, as bones always do. You could see where it had been part of a hand. How does one open a jar holding this? Carefully, and by filming oneself doing it, because the world has learned the price of mistrust. The director wore gloves. The police wore their duty on their faces. Samuel stood near the door because his body wanted an escape it had not reconciled with his mind. The lid loosened with a little sounds like a decision. The room smelt of ethanol and something else a human nose recognizes without schooling. Protein gone quiet and solvent. The finger slipped into a sterile dish. It did not unlock any appropriate words. The director whispered, "Mon Dieu," but only because organ and God do not rhyme in any language, and atheism, in the sensitive, becomes shy at the threshold of certain pronouns. They took samples, not of the old label. The label was nothing, but of the tissue. They took care not to compromise the possibility of story. They sent the samples to a lab in Europe that processed such things without comment. They extracted the DNA from what was left of the soft tissues. There was enough. They matched it to a sample of Jacob's toothbrush kept by his sister for years as if grief were a courthouse and evidence must be stored. The match was conclusive. The finger had belonged to Dr. Jacob Riedel. News has angles. Reporters tried several. Mystery solved, one wrote, and Amy called to say, "It is not solved." The Jungle's trophy, wrote another, and Simon wrote a letter to the editor that began with the sentence, "The Jungle desires nothing." A tabloid found a photograph of Jacob from 2003, smiling as if someone had told a joke he had decided to permit himself to enjoy. They put the word grizzly in their head and discovered that clicks are their own ethics. The university in Basel held a small press conference and spoke with the sort of careful sorrow 3 institutions had trained it to wear. The Congolese press had bigger stories that week. The priest in the village by the river did not read any paper that could have told him he had been part of the chain of custody of a man's fraction. In Freiburg, Jacob's mother sat at a table and asked the heir which finger. The heir did not answer. It had, for once, the decency to confine itself to its element. If one element of the story invited too much speculation, it was this. Who put the finger in the jar? Jacob himself, as a morbid stowaway in a list of specimens, assigning a bit of his own flesh to the same regimen as the plants. Evidence, order, name? Someone else who had access to the genetics of pity and irony? Theories ranged. A cut sustained in the field, a preservation impulse responding to the fevered need to record, to save DNA as insurance against being taken wholly? Or a signature sent by a human adversary, the kind of intimate violence that says, "We can do this to you," and writes it insolvent? Or a field exigency, an amputation done to save, the severed part kept in case. In case of what? In case the world became humane in new ways later? There was no scar to examine, no body to match. There was only the organ and the jar and a label that wasn't. Amy refused to make up one more sentence than she had to. He insisted on labels, she told a reporter. The absence is either his decision or someone else's. The reporter asked her to choose. "I will not choose between ghosts," she said. Time does not yield to narrative even when narrative demands the courtesy. The jar returned to Europe and to a drawer where curators' hands opened it precisely and for reasons logged. It did not go on display. It did not want to. The finger was rescanned at intervals, its decline more than anything evidence that biology puzzles out no bargains. Meanwhile, the jars of plants yielded what they could. An alkaloid family Amy named not for Jacob, but for the river that had made her its student, because naming your dead after geography is how you admit both belong to scales larger than your sorrow. A paper was published with too many authors and too few adjectives. The Pharmaceutical Foundation sent a letter that used the words promising twice and remuneration once and condolences 3 times. A journalist called the paper a consolation prize, and Simon, who had learned not to balance comprehension on such narrow beams, suggested the journalist take a long walk. A year after the finger, a truck drove up to the field station. No longer the field station, really, but a building the government had remembered it owned. Men pried open the swollen door. Inside, the past breath. Papers so damp they had adhered into a single leaf. A dead bat that had become the color of calculus. On a shelf, in a corner the bats had not reached, another metal cabinet. Inside, jars. Old labels and new mold. One jar contained a ribbon of bark like a brown twist of sugar. Another contained a lizard with its mouth open, forever obliged to remain curious. On the bottom shelf, a jar with a lid that had corroded into a different metal, and in it twig fragments and a ring of something white that might or might not be bone. The men did not linger. The station was dismantled with the careful impatience of a budget spent before the end of the quarter. The jars went where they always go: university, then lab, then a ledger which is never as good as a grave. Amy went back once, a pilgrimage she told no one about in advance because she did not want to have to endure anyone's idea of humility. The clearing had changed. The cassava had grown and been harvested by someone else, and then forgotten again. The veranda had rotted. The blue tarp had long been declared a life by spiders. She stood in the place where she had once set a kettle to boil, and she imagined the single minute in which a person decides to step forward into a question and loses, by fine degrees, the possibility of a foot turned backward. She felt no presence. She felt the forest's dismissal of all but its own business. "You do not mourn the way we do," she told it. The forest said, "If forests say anything, we do not mourn at all." When people talk about Jacob now, they tell 2 stories. The first is biography as established in florists and memorial lectures. A serious man who treated the discipline like a promise. A teacher who taught with graphite and tenderness. A colleague who filed permits before his flights and left keys where they belonged. The second is a coven of doubts. They talk about the tent empty and the notebook smeared. They speak of Ngoya, the place where palms redden at the ribs and time is said to misbehave. They say his fingers surfaced and belonged to him, and that means the rest belongs to someone else, and the phrase someone else is allowed to be large. The forest, war, a man with a gun and a grievance. Chance, the unambitious malice of bacteria. Someone always asks whether Amy regrets. Regret is a bad map, she says. It shows a road back that is not there. There was a memorial in Basel in a room with white walls, because institutions like to settle sorrow where it will not stain. People spoke in paragraphs. A friend told about Jacob's delight at finding a caterpillar asleep in the collar of a leaf, how he had laughed like a boy shaking a gift box he knew held exactly what he wanted. His sister read from a letter he had sent when he was 24 working in Madagascar, how he had gotten lost and found a river and followed it out, how he had written, "I realized I could survive almost anything as long as I had water and a pencil." The room made the noise rooms make when everyone agrees to admit something they had set aside. He was gone precisely because he was what he was. Years later, a young botanist began a petition to name a new species of vine for Jacob. Amy declined to sign, privately. She told the student in an email he would have vetoed it. "The species, if you've got it right, is larger than any one of us." She offered a different idea. Name it for the woman healer by the river who had taught Jacob the word for the bitterness that arrives before numbness, the living sensation of medicine. The student agreed. A generation of students learned the plant by a name that tasted good in the mouth of the village and awkward on a European tongue. That arrangement pleased the world more than a tombstone. The finger still exists. You could go see it if you knew whom to ask, and were made of the sort of politeness that qualifies a stranger for certain kinds of sadness. It sits in ethanol under a lid that has been changed twice. It is quieter now, as if the alcohol had taught it a new grammar. You would not wish to look too long at it, and yet you might. Nothing about it instructs the mind in what to believe. It instructs only in what to accept, that sometimes a forest returns a portion of what it borrowed so that the living have an address to send their sentences to. If there is a way to end such a story, it is not by manufacturing triumph. It is by staying, briefly, with the tent at dawn when a pan catches a drip and the air is blue with cool, and a notebook lies open on a table under a tarp and a hand that knows it has only time for a line or two chooses, instead of compressing the world into facts, to write something generous. Today the forest smells like pepper and rain. We will go east to the rise, and then north toward the red palms. If the path resists, we will not push it. The hand underlines red palms once and then, in a gesture his friends would recognize, twice. And then he tucks the pencil behind his ear because his hands have not learned their last lesson. He steps into the world he has learned how to walk in, and he is perfectly ordinary, and in that ordinariness lives everything that made him beloved. Behind him, people who love him may begin to worry and then to act. Ahead of him, there is a space that will accept his body, and then, out of reasons too old for us and not malicious, it will keep it. Once, a year after the finger, Samuel the tech walked past the cabinet where the jar lived and saw on a table a plant he had never seen named, a piece of that antique vine's cousin, with little white flowers like stars drowned in milk. He touched the leaf. It felt like an idea that had to be written down. He did not know that the plant would be used to build a molecule that would make a parasite forget its plan. He knew only that names were being given in another room and that someone in a picture on a notice board had taught his hands a certain way to hold glass. He picked up a jar and he labeled it carefully and he placed it where it belonged. He could hear rain. He imagined a tent and a man standing. And because he wished it, the man turned toward him, just for a moment, and nodded thanks. It is not closure. It is not even consolation. It is the modest gift the world offers to the living in lieu of sense, a sequence of caring acts after the last benediction. A well-tied label. A drawer arranged so that the right thing can be found with the lights out. A story told without rumor. A grave no one can visit, and a jar some people do. And in the forest, far to the southeast of a map whose corners have been chewed by the weather, a place where palms redden in their ribs and a canopy vaults like a sanctuary roof, a vine loops itself loosened around a trunk and continues, in no one's honor, to weave.